There's a particular kind of power that reveals itself not in what a leader does, but in what a leader no longer has to do. For most of the past decade, Xi Jinping has exuded that power by largely stopping foreign travel, and the world came to him instead. Foreign leaders flew into Beijing, sat through the choreography and flew home again. According to figures compiled by the Asia Society, Xi averaged around 14 overseas trips a year between 2013 and 2019, then cut that to roughly 6 a year between 2022 and 2025. In 2020, he left the country only once. In 2021, he didn't leave at all, ostensibly due to the COVID crisis. But the signal was unmistakable. The center of geopolitical gravity had moved, and it sat in Beijing, waiting for everyone else to arrive. So when Xi boarded a plane to Pyongyang at the start of June 2026, the destination rocked the news. This was his first visit to North Korea in 7 years and his first overseas trip of the entire year. It was a stunning switch. Xi, the man who makes the world come to him, instead, went to none other than Kim Jong Un. To understand why a leader who hoards his own movement so carefully could be tricked into spending that capital, traveling to the most isolated regime on Earth, we have to follow a chain of leverage. And that chain doesn't begin in Pyongyang or in Beijing, but on the artillery lines of eastern Ukraine. Let's start with the cage Kim Jong Un used to live in. For decades, North Korea was the textbook junior partner, and China held the keys. Estimates of Pyongyang's trade dependence on China vary, but they all point in the same direction. The National Committee on North Korea put it as high as 95% in a 2022 estimate. Another tally cited in 2026 still place it above 90%. Whatever the precise figure, the implication is that North Korea was sanctioned, isolated, and economically tied to a single partner. Notably, trade represented a tiny portion of the country's economy due to sanctions forcing it to produce whatever it can domestically. But there's only so much you can make, and oil reserves are not something that North Korea has. Instead, many of the resources it relied upon came from China. Beijing would have two levers on North Korea. There was the economic one, the simple fact that it could tighten the flow of energy imports and trade on which North Korea depended, limiting the country's ability to import critical goods and export its products abroad. And there was the diplomatic one, the denuclearization issue, which China could raise or lower as a way of managing its unruly neighbor and signaling to Washington that it had influence worth bargaining with. Kim had exactly one tree to hang from, and Beijing owned the tree. It's worth pausing to closer examine how hollow the so-called alliance underneath all this always was, because it explains why China can't simply order Pyongyang to fall in line. On paper, the bond looks ironclad. Using the 1961 Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation and Mutual Assistance, whose 65th anniversary falls this year, is the only formal military alliance treaty China still maintains with anyone, and it contains a clause obliging each side to come to the other's defense if attacked. But the lived reality has been far frostier than the document suggests, marked by long stretches of mutual suspicion. There's also a structural contradiction baked into the relationship that no treaty can paper over. Beijing has always wanted a North Korea that's obedient and stable, a buffer it can manage, not a North Korea that's genuinely powerful and unpredictable on its border. Pyongyang, for its part, has always wanted unconditional backing without strings and has treated Chinese meddling in its internal affairs and its weapons program as a kind of soft intrusion to be resisted. As the International Crisis Group noted, Beijing has long been wary of helping build up North Korea's military precisely because a militarily emboldened Pyongyang is a source of instability rather than an asset. And those two visions were always in tension. The war in Ukraine became an opening for Kim Jong Un to test the barriers of those visions and see how much China values having North Korea in its corner. And the reason for that is that Russia came into the war fully expecting not to need nearly as many resources as it did. But as you very well know, the invasion of Ukraine turned into a grinding artillery war, the kind that devours shells faster than a wartime economy can produce them. Moscow found itself short, and it went looking for ammunition wherever it could find it. The scale of what followed can even be followed through open source evidence. The Open Source Centre, a UK-based research group, worked with Reuters to track the shipments using satellite imagery, and the Royal United Services Institute summarised the findings. Between roughly August 2023 and the spring of 2025, A small fleet of Russian-flagged vessels made on the order of 64 voyages, hauling around 15,800 shipping containers from the North Korean port of Rajin to Russia's Far East. Estimates suggest that the containers total between 4.2 and 5.8 million artillery rounds. By early 2026, that number went to a staggering 33,000 containers and an estimated 15 million rounds of 152mm shells. To put that number in perspective, Western and Ukrainian officials believe Russia's own factories produced no more than 2.3 million shells domestically in 2024. When we extrapolate this to the duration of the war and possible production, North Korea could have been supplying potentially around 40% of the ammunition Russia was firing, and some individual Russian artillery units, according to documents reviewed by Reuters, were running on between 50 and 100% North Korean rounds. But while this might all sound like background noise in the realm of the actual war in Ukraine, the industrial side of the feat is what makes it vital for North Korea-China relations. North Korea had a sanction-starved defense sector that the outside world had written off as a rusting Cold War relic, and suddenly it had a guaranteed mega customer with a practically bottomless appetite. The result is that the war in Ukraine and the resulting need for ammunition were a stimulus program for the North Korean military-industrial base, a reason to run the shell lines at full capacity, refurbish old plants, keep workers employed, and most importantly, get a stock of foreign currency. The war is also a live-fire laboratory. Every system North Korea ships east and every soldier it rotates through the front comes back in principle with battlefield feedback that no amount of peacetime testing could buy. The production figures here are inferred from the export volumes rather than measured directly inside North Korea, which remains one of the most opaque states on Earth. But the direction is clear. The war did for Pyongyang's arms industry what no domestic policy ever could. And speaking of live-fire testing, there's also the tiny matter of North Korean soldiers as they're part of the same upgrade. North Korea rotated troops into the theater, with outside estimates suggesting between 14,000 and 15,000 troops over the course of the war. Of those, it was estimated that North Korea lost a staggering 6,000 of them at least. And the very presence of North Korean troops in one of the most technologically assisted wars has been poked fun at relentlessly. But beyond the grim reminder that they were used as frontline expendables, the deployments are a training pipeline and a way for North Korea to get real-time insight into how military tactics worked in the 21st century. Remember, while technically in a frozen conflict with South Korea, North Korea's army hasn't been in a war since the 1950s and had no real way to train with modern militaries. And through all these, Kim got paid in a few different currencies at once. The first was cash, and the numbers floated by Seoul are striking. South Korea's Institute for National Security Strategy, a government-funded body, has estimated that Moscow may have paid North Korea as much as $14.4 billion for troop deployments and arms. The same analysis also suggests Pyongyang may have received only between $580 million and $1.5 billion of it in the form of actual goods, with the rest suspected to be equal trade of sensitive military technology. Analysts suggest technology transfers may have formed part of the compensation package, and it may matter more than money. The exact contents of the transfer are murky, and much of what circulates is informed speculation rather than confirmed fact. But the categories observers point to are consistent and include satellite and space launch assistance and air defense help. The third currency ties directly into why North Korea could suddenly break free from China's chokehold: oil. Before the war, China was the one and only supplier of oil and petroleum products to North Korea, supplying the Friendship Pipeline so North Korea could run its one oil refinery for domestic needs. But a joint investigation by the outlets iStories and OCCRP, working again with the Open Source Center, found that in 2024, Russia covertly transported roughly 1.5 million barrels of petroleum products into North Korea, which is around triple the annual cap the United Nations had set for Pyongyang. These were paltry figures compared to Russia's oil exports and refining capacities, but it meant North Korea could get a vital boost in petroleum rather than relying on its official partner. The last currency is the one that breaks the old system entirely, and it's political. Russia has effectively walked away from the sanctions regime it once helped uphold, shielding North Korea at the United Nations and, in practical terms, treating it as a fellow nuclear weapon state. That recognition is worth more to Kim than any single shipment, because it validates the very arsenal that used to define his isolation. Days before Xi arrived, Kim's sister, Kim Yo-jong, publicly described the country's nuclear status as irreversible, By outside estimate, North Korea had somewhere around 60 warheads in mid-2026, and on the eve of the summit, Kim was photographed touring what state media billed as a weapons-grade nuclear materials facility and a uranium enrichment site. This is a regime that has stopped asking permission. Which brings us to the core of the story and where the lever of leverage turned. But before we get into the gritty details, make sure to subscribe to the Military Show to keep up with all the news in global geopolitics. Back to Kim Jong Un. China's economic grip on North Korea only ever worked because Pyongyang had nowhere else to go. It really didn't matter that North Korea's external trade was a fraction of its economy, but that most of that trade was funneled to a single country that could any point stop and leave it completely isolated. But for the first time since Kim took power in 2011, he now had an alternative. Russia can supply grain, fuel, cash, technology, and diplomatic cover. The leash that Beijing spent decades tightening went slack, not because China did anything wrong, but because a second patron walked onto the field. And the moment a second buyer exists, the first buyer loses the ability to dictate terms. This is what reversed the polarity between Xi and Kim. Beijing's nightmare scenario is not that North Korea fires another missile, it's that North Korea drifts permanently into Russia's orbit and decouples from China for good, leaving Beijing with a nuclear-armed neighbor it no longer has any line into. Suddenly, it's China that needs the relationship stabilized, since it can actually lose globally from neglecting a neighbor that is at times too trigger-happy for its own good. And Kim has read into that anxiety precisely, and can now charge with the privilege of soothing it. All he has to do was host the summit, allow a few warm lines into a joint statement, and let Xi return home with the ability to claim that Beijing still influences Pyongyang. In exchange, the analysts watching this expect the tangible things Kim actually wants. The telling part is that North Korea now has more connections to the world, as China resumed a 6-year block on the cross-border railway service between Beijing and Pyongyang in March 2026. That train carries passengers, but it also carries currency and geopolitical insight into one of the most powerful nations in the world. Which brings us to the visit itself and why it was so important. Xi was the one who traveled. A leader who has spent years making the world come to him got on the plane and he went largely on Kim's terms. Notably, nowhere in the visit was the discussion on North Korea's nuclear armament and possible demilitarization. The Brookings Institution analyzed the summit and noted that while Chinese officials still say denuclearization remains the official line, Beijing has stopped emphasizing it in public. This is precisely because Pyongyang has flatly rejected it, and Russia has supported North Korea as a nuclear-armed nation. Pushing the denuclearization issue only risks alienating Kim at the worst possible moment. For the Kim regime, the takeaway is that Beijing is no longer willing to make the relationship conditional on the nuclear question. Instead, China is basically going to need to find another way to curb its smallest neighbor into submission. That alone is a major strategic win for Pyongyang. The fact that Xi chose North Korea as his first foreign destination of the year was itself suggested as an endorsement, a gift of legitimacy handed to Kim both at home and abroad. There is a symbolic shift buried in the language too. The old framing of this relationship leaned on the imagery of comrades and brothers, with an unmistakable hierarchy underneath it, an elder and a junior. The reporting around this summit increasingly describes something flatter, a strategic partnership between actors who mind their own interests. If we look past the verbiage, it's actually a demotion for Beijing. It's no longer an older brother to a dependent North Korea, but a strategic partner for a nation that now has economic opportunities, whether those were created by its own ambitions or not. But while the China-North Korea relations dynamics have changed, it's also important to discuss how that affects global geopolitics, particularly with the US. Part of what Beijing has historically gotten out of the North Korea relationship is a chip to play against the United States. As a trading partner, it was one power that could restrain Pyongyang, and therefore a partner Washington needs to keep on side. But that chip works only if China can actually deliver restraint. After Xi met with President Donald Trump earlier in 2026, the American and Chinese accounts of what was discussed diverged tellingly on exactly this issue, with Washington keeping the language of denuclearization front and center, while Beijing's framing pushed it to the margins. If Xi wants to keep using North Korea as leverage with the Americans but can't actually control that leverage, then a visit to Pyongyang serves a purpose beyond bilateral warmth. It's a performance of influence staged partly for an audience in Washington. The trouble is that performing influence and possessing it are not the same thing, and Kim knows the difference better than anyone. And just so the point wouldn't be missed, Kim made one with hardware. North Korea carried out a salvo of short-range ballistic missiles in late May, shortly before the visit was even announced. This fits a long-running pattern in the playbook, the habit of firing something into the sea right before a major meeting, as if to communicate that North Korea keeps its own schedule, whether the guest comes or not. If China had more control of North Korea, it could postpone the visit or force it to stop the showcase of its missile armament. But since China needed Korea's assistance, the entire thing was swept under the rug. So does the title hold up? Did Kim fool Xi? The honest answer is more interesting than a simple yes. There was no real con where Kim tricked Xi with a false promise. What instead happened was that by the time Xi sat down in Pyongyang, there was no good move left to make. North Korea now had all the leverage, accumulated from Russia sending vital supplies and giving North Korea's industry something to export to someone other than China. However, it's important to note that it's not that China simply lost. The Russia windfall has a ceiling, and it may be approaching. By late 2025, Ukrainian military intelligence was reporting that North Korean shell deliveries had fallen sharply. The report suggested that Pyongyang's reserves had fallen to the point where the country couldn't keep up with its domestic production and maintain the stockpile. We should note that this is a Ukrainian government assessment, and later reports indicated that the transport has reached higher levels in early 2026. But this points to the fact that an economy built on selling shells into someone else's war is hostage to that war. Russia's progress in the war completely stalled in 2026, with March being the first month since Ukraine's 2023 counter-offensive that Kyiv managed to take more territory than it lost. Russia is faced with a degradation of its artillery capabilities, stemming from either losing or wearing out artillery systems. If there's nothing to fire the artillery, there's no need to import as much from North Korea, and Kim's leverage decreases as a result. North Korea understands this, which is why it's reportedly shifting toward drone production and sending workers to Russian factories. It's trying to convert a one-time artillery ammunition deal into something more durable. From there, North Korea's economy could become inadvertently entwined with Russia's military-industrial complex as a whole. And the Russian effort will keep running on all cylinders regardless of how the war goes, since it literally can't afford to stop and give the impression that it will concede to Ukraine, a country that it invaded. The second caveat is that Putin is not Kim's friend either. He uses North Korea as much as Beijing once did, and there are analysts who suspect Moscow is happy to dangle Pyongyang in front of China, partly to keep Beijing off balance. Kim is balancing between two larger powers that both want to use him, and that balancing act is precarious by nature. The whole strategy depends on keeping both patrons convinced they can't afford to lose him, and that's a difficult posture to hold indefinitely. And the third caveat is that some analysts frame the meeting as one where both leaders walked away with something. Kim got legitimacy and a relationship freed from the nuclear condition. Xi got to reassert that China remains Pyongyang's indispensable economic partner and to remind Washington, after his own recent meetings with Trump and Putin, that Beijing is still a central player in the region. China is effectively maintaining the status quo, and it would take something extraordinary for North Korea to be able to nudge that balance beyond symbolic gestures. So where does this triangle go from here? The next move's already visible if you know where to look. The first signal arrives in July 2026. That's when the 1961 treaty marks its 65th anniversary, and the question is whether Beijing puts anything concrete behind the warm words. Anything from an arms sale, an air defense package, or a joint naval drill, something that China particularly likes performing now and again. All of those would shift the balance toward China being Korea's main host, but the absence of it would be equally telling. The second signal is the rhythm of North Korea's missile tests. If Kim keeps launching on his own schedule, it suggests Beijing's influence is still more performance than substance. And the deepest question is one the war itself will answer, whether Kim can convert a one-time artillery windfall into something durable before the fighting winds down and the Russian dividend deflates, which is exactly why those North Korean workers reportedly heading to Russia's drone plants may matter more than any single summit photograph. Until one of those things breaks the pattern, the balance holds. China manages, Russia uses, and Kim, for now, keeps both of them booking the flights. But the big part of the picture is not how North Korea is playing China off Russia, but how China and Russia's relationship is getting strained. To learn more, make sure to subscribe to The Military Show as we cover all the intricacies of Russian politics.